Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Dave Latorra. I'm going to be talking to you in this presentation about THC inflation and the phenomenon known as lab shopping. First, start off, talk a little bit about myself and my qualifications for giving this presentation. I have experience with 4 different analytical testing labs as a lab director in 3 different states. 2 of those were in California, 1 in Oregon, and 1 in New Mexico. Of course, all those states operate under different state regulations. My scientific background is I have a bachelor's in biochemistry, master's in microbiology, and a PhD in biology, focused on molecular biology and zoology. Prior to joining the cannabis industry, I had a long career in life sciences. A lot of that work was field applications scientist, support, troubleshooting and training in labs throughout the United States for different scientific groups that provided tools for researchers. I've also worked in the human identification testing field, human relationship testing. And as you can imagine, all of these different industries groups have their different quality systems. Most recently, since my last full-time position in the lab director spot, I've been developing some businesses of my own. One thing I'm focusing on is a new startup looking at cannabis DNA specific applications. That looks like an underserved market to myself, and that's called Ganja Genomics. And a brand new entity we're starting with a partner very soon is called DNA is Love. Just wanted to give a little disclaimer too in this talk that all the comments I'll make here are really my personal opinion and feedback from other scientists, business people I've spoken to. Not any specific calling out of any group or individual for any of these. This is obviously a little bit of a contentious topic that we'll talk about here. So for the session overview, here's kind of what I would like to try to get across, and we'll discuss a little bit. First is kind of the science of THC testing, what the molecule looks like, what the chemistry of it is that. I then want to spend some time and talk about the situation and the background of these analytical testing labs and the situation that they find themselves under. It's potency testing that we're talking about, but there's a whole spectrum of testing that needs to be done for state compliance. So we'll discuss that a little bit. Then I'll get into the nitty-gritty, what exactly is lab shopping and this THC inflation. And then what are some of the ways that growers and the labs have tried to gain an advantage or more or less cheat. I'll discuss some ways people and companies are reacting to these changes, these situations that come up, these unfair competitive advantages. And then finally, I'll propose some solutions for the field to help get back on the path where everything is more level playing field. So first off, let me start with a little bit of the science behind this. As many people know, many of the research and scientific people in this field, that the major cannabinoids, there's a couple different metabolic pathways. CBD and THC, there's a standard form and an acidic form, and they have the same precursor molecules. This shows that pathway that THC and CBD follow. And again, you can see they branch off at the midpoint here, and they have a different endpoint molecule. So these are the chemistry differences that we're looking at in a typical potency profile, where we're looking at 10 to 15, upwards of 16 to 18 different cannabinoids, which will come off on the HPLC. Next, I want to talk about an overview of the potency testing process itself. So HPLC is the instrument of choice for doing this, and that stands for high performance liquid chromatography. It gives the most accurate in-depth profile available for the different cannabis types. And this can also be from the different starting materials. So all products that will go into stores, dispensaries need to get tested for a range of chemical properties. Those are the cannabinoids, right? And then, but also residual solvents, if it's a processed like oil or tincture, that type of thing. Pesticides, all products, heavy metals. And again, these may vary a little bit. The menu of testing will vary a little bit from state to state. So back to potency, the first really couple steps in the process is the HPLC calibration, getting it to an operational phase, and then training on the HPLC. There's actually just a couple of noted vendors in this field. I'm not going to really name names in this talk, but if anybody that's worked in this knows who kind of the couple providers are. There's a little more high-end solution in terms of instruments and software, a little more affordable solution, that type of thing. So then the actual process starts with the sampling. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the sampling in a couple slides. The weighing of the correct amount of the material, and this is all per the lab, SOPs, standard operating procedures, right? And then a chemical extraction takes place. Usually it's a methanol and dilution type of procedure. Once that happens, the sample, along with the rest of the day's batch, will get injected into the HPLC, and there's usually an auto sampler, and then the samples will be processed in the order that they are run. After that, the process will be like automated data analysis, and then there is a chance to do manual data override, which is something else we'll talk a little bit about. And again, the HPLC is capable of testing all those different cannabinoids that you're seeing on the slide here. So Delta 9, Delta 8, THCV, so forth, all the CBD derivatives, for example. And then, anything that's to be added to the standard list is more methods validation process. Different cannabinoids can be added, at any point in time through a validation and revalidation as necessary. Here's sort of just a little bit of a view of what this equipment looks like. So here's an HPLC from a vendor. It's a little bit of a white box. There's definitely some different pumps inside, pressure, and then the key of the whole thing is a column. So it's chromatography basically, and the chemicals to go through, and then the software will give you the peaks, and I'll show you an example of data here that comes off in just a moment. All right, so here's a schematic. Here's just a view of a cannabinoid profile by HPLC. And what you'll basically see is a series of peaks here. And what these peaks are during the chromatography process, these are held onto the column for a different amount of what's called retention time. And that separates the different compounds from each other. Sometimes this is nice, clear, easy to use separation. Sometimes it needs work and fine tuning to optimize the method. So all that work gets rolled into what's called the validation process as it goes through the state approval process for these different states. Basically, you want a reproducible, standardized procedure that can handle the different types of samples in a very reproducible, clear, easy to discriminate way, right? And again, the software will mostly do this for you, but it does allow you to modify, change things, right? So those changes are one of the things we talk about, as a potential for what gets called as this, what gets called as that, what gets changed around a little bit. One thing with the cannabis testing field is it's really relatively, compared to other fields, compared to food testing, compared to medical diagnostics, it's in its infancy. So the regulations, the requirements, the quality systems for this are more of a work in progress. As everyone knows, there are no national standards at this point, so there are different state-specific certifications. Some labs, many labs, try to go on and achieve ISO 17025 accreditation. That's generally a work in process for a startup lab. And, from my experience, there's quite a variation in the quality lab systems. And really, some of these are kind of borrowed and taken and modified from other industries. The thing that is always to keep in mind with cannabis is it's a relatively very complex compound and class of compounds. There's so many different types of materials in each sample: carbohydrates, fats, lipids, DNA, and on, and also all the cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, all those type of compounds. So it's a very, very complex matrix compared to what is often tested in other fields. It's important that everything in the lab is calibrated properly, so all the instruments, balances, pipettes, and the use of appropriate certified reference materials is really important. Standard setting as the first potency calibration and so forth gets done, it needs to be accurate and precise to start with. So that's where the starting point for the whole validation process begins. Most states, again, there's some differences from state to state, and I'm going to definitely talk about the regulations and how that all fits in the whole THC inflation process here. So just again, giving you a little bit of a baseline on this. The methods include accuracy, precision, limit of detection, and quantitation. Those are two slightly different but a little bit similar processes of basically how low can you measure, because a lot of these compounds are going to be in a very, very low amount. Then how reproducible is it? How does it look when you're looking with multiple analysts with the same procedure, the same samples, all those things. So it actually becomes like weeks to months long process, entire validation process. And really kind of new to the field as just emerging too, but all labs in those other industries that I've talked about, really you want to do some type of proficiency testing programs. Maybe lab sharing of samples back and forth, really anything you do to improve your quality metrics and show the quality of data that comes off is definitely a benefit. So this is my experience from working at several of these cannabis testing labs, and what I want to get across here is that on top of the whole lab shopping issue, these are very difficult situations to start to deal with, right? First of all, it takes a huge investment to get a lab up and running. The first thing is the facilities need to be on top notch. Electrical, HVAC, for example, are complex. The instrumentations is very costly. I mean, it can actually take $1 million to maybe $1.5 million worth of investment, because not only are you having to pick up an HPLC, but you need an ICP-MS for metals testing, you need GC triple quad, LC triple quad, and qPCR for those other testing menus on the list that need to be in. So between the instruments, service contracts, chemicals, consumables, it's a very costly process to start and own and run a laboratory. Another difficulty is really just getting trained staff to run some of these instrumentation as the field expands, as the number of people increase and the number of labs increase. There are only so many qualified chemists that have the background to do this well and step in on it. Again, as I mentioned, cannabis is a complex matrix, so it's difficult. It's kind of challenging to work with. And the other thing is there are not that many people yet who've moved across, have stepped away from mainstream industries to get into the cannabis field, because once you move in that direction, it may not be that easy to move back. And due to that, there's really been quite a bit of high turnover for lab director, quality chemist positions. It's been some definite turnover, which is part of a little bit of the issue of the whole field, in my estimation. Another factor the labs have to deal with is a LIMS system, so we need integration on the software on the IT end from when a sample gets ordered to be picked up and collected, all the way through the lab processing, through the generation of what's called a certificate of analysis, a COA, which is basically the results, and through the entire process, with including all the data. So that's another big lift for the labs. So most of these labs are understaffed, kind of under financial stress, and they've been through this validation process. And my experience, all of the labs I've been at, the length and the complexity of that validation is underappreciated. And I also do think there's a little bit of a disconnect between the state regulations, the regulators, and the labs in terms of what's required. So it's a bit of a interpretation guessing game. And I think that's the education on both sides of the fence that kind of leads to that point. Okay, the next thing I want to add to this, there's some things we should discuss. One is there's natural biological variation between the samples. I want to talk about for a minute the effect of the regulations on this. And then, taking it all the way to the spectrum of intentional manipulation of data. That's what we're kind of talking about from, and it's a range of what is causing discrepancies in THC values. So again, first of all, cannabis is a very complex dynamic plant. There are many factors where the THC level can vary, and the CBD, all the cannabinoid levels can vary. So basically a lab test at a given point in time is kind of a single snapshot. And really it's an N of one. So there's going to be some bias to a single sample. And, crucially important that I'll talk to you in a minute too, is the sampling process itself. So how are you guaranteeing that you're taking a reproducible, homogeneous mixture of the sample that is for this entire batch, which can be a pretty large amount of material. And again, mostly in this kind of sampling thing, we're talking about flower, right? Because once a thing is processed, say an edible or something, it's a much more homogeneous mix. The flower itself is kind of where the complexity of the biology mostly comes into play. One thing I want to just say is that, it's really all testing that's being done is compared to the alternative out there, right? Which is the black market, which is no testing. So all testing is good testing in the right direction, but it has to be to the best of our scientific knowledge and, again, this fair playing field. And that's where, the entire process of the lab shopping comes into play. And I think this kind of starts at a grassroots level, right? So it's the consumer out there saying, I want to have the highest THC amount. I'm going to get the best high and for the least price. That's what they're after. They're after the most bang, the most buzz they can get for their buck, in effect. And as the science is coming out, here we are in 2023, people are finding out there's a lot more to the experience, right? For the health, for the wellness, for the recreation, for the entertainment. It's all these different compounds in the plant. It's the terpenes, flavonoids, or a number of other cannabinoids. The research is just so young in this field that there's a lot that's unknown yet. So there's a full spectrum of chemicals and compounds that go into the whole experience. It's not just best THC is best time, best medicine, best anything. So that's one thing that influences this whole thing. That's why there's encouragement to cheat to get the highest THC levels for the dollar amount involved. Okay, so what is lab shopping? And let's get right into it. This is the phenomenon we're talking about, right? It's a situation that's grown over time from consumer demand. Highest THC level of flower, highest, biggest high, best value, right? That's what they're trying to go for. Here we are in 2023, finding there's more to it. The science of the other compounds are important, but it's this phenomenon where growers, producers were encouraging, favoring, going to labs, testing things in multiple labs, and going with the lab that would give them the highest results for whatever reasons, whether those are scientifically valid or not. And that's where the whole thing about cheating on a level playing field comes into play. So again, mostly this is flower samples we're talking about. It's just a little bit different type of testing, and the variation is less with these other product classes, the concentrates, the oils, the edibles, beverages, and so forth. My experience definitely says this, there's been unfair competition, an unequal playing field. There's an example where, anonymous testing has been done to compare 6 or 7 labs, and I'll show you a slide in a second to show what that looked like. Results from certain labs are, outliers on the high end of the range, and, in a lot of cases, these labs will outcompete legitimate, scientifically valid laboratories, and to the point of hurting their business enough to send them toward heading out of business. Here's a showing of some example, just some THC data from looking at 1, 2, 3, like 6 of the cannabinoids, right? And the majority of the labs are labs 1 through, there are actually 8 labs in this study. The majority of them were in a very tight range. However, there's one, if you look at the red boxes, there is definitely kind of an outlier lab there, like lab 4, which was producing consistently inflated results compared to the rest of the group. So something is going on there, like that, that's where there needs to be a system, process in place where this kind of thing can happen, whether in different situations. Like, so how do we deal with this? This is, the potentially unfair advantage that we need to deal with as an industry to move it forward, move it more scientifically valid and reproducible. And also, this is very impactful on the consumer end. As you'll see. All right, next I just want to go into some of the ways that the data can be manipulated a little bit. There are a lot of variables at play here. To me, probably the biggest one in this whole phenomenon is one before testing takes place in the lab, which is basically accurate sampling. So it would be pretty easy, without doing it scientifically properly, to get higher THC values. You just pick the part of the plant, the sparkling part of the plant with the most trichomes, and you have a good chance of getting more of all the cannabinoids out. So the states write regulations to try to force this to happen. Regulations are complex and not really easy to understand, and I feel like in a lot of cases not followed. This is also a very difficult one to monitor and enforce, because it's just a sampling person at a collection site, and there are probably video cameras of it, of the process, but really beyond that, it's not tracked like something that once it's inside the lab. So it's the quality of the sample in, quality of the result out, right? Another couple places where there can be, movement of the data, I'll say, is inaccurately weighing or reporting the weights of samples as you're starting the process. Another place where manual override can take place is just a little bit on the data quantitation and analysis side. And then, there's been labs that I have no knowledge of this personally. I've not ever seen or heard anything, but outright manipulation of data reported on COAs. I've heard things like someone will ask for something and then it will get delivered if needed. So that's what we're trying to contend with. And the more we can veer toward the hard, solid science, the better we're going to be. So next, I just want to touch on what are some consequences of this, right? And I have kind of really touched on it, for the industry and the field, but it goes beyond that. It goes to our whole essence as a valid industry, right? Consumer dosing is critical, right? So people need solid numbers to know how they're going to feel with these different products. And it's also not just flower, but they get a number, they feel like they can do something with a flower sample and take it over to a different type of product, an edible or a concentrate or something. And if the results of any of them are off significantly, they're not getting the right information for themselves, for their health, for their well-being, that kind of. So it actually hurts the confidence in the sector as a whole. I think it hurts the investment in the sector as a whole too. This lack of confidence and trust in scientific methods and the processes behind it. I've been in executive management meetings where we had very hard decisions to make. How do we deal with this? We're reporting results accurately to the best of our knowledge, and we're getting out competed by labs that are not. So a couple suggestions are: one, we maybe stop testing for flower altogether. It's not a good situation, but it's not a level playing field. You're doing that, and you're also maybe making a little bit of a statement. You're hoping you can build a market on the other type of testing. It's not the way to go, but it's one thing. People are talking about maybe stopping testing altogether for THC. So there's any number of things that have been discussed. And the labs are frustrated. The labs, it's a bread and butter test, everyone's potency test. It's a difficult test to run. Actually, the flower samples are the hardest. They actually are hardest on the instruments. They take more maintenance and more cleanup because there's so many dense compounds in cannabis during the testing process. So I think labs would prefer to just test other types of products, but I don't think that's a sustainable model. A very difficult financial business model anyway that these labs are in, as I've tried to kind of get across. All right, and finally, so where do we go, right? What could we do from here? And I have a couple of suggestions. These things will take time to evolve. Maybe some of them will make sense, some not as much. One thing is, at the consumer level, I think better education is important. We have to kind of get off of this. Most THC for the least amount of dollars is our best way to go. There's much more to it than that, and there's a lot of complexity in it, okay? One thing is the U.S. federal government is not helping anything here, right? They're very confused that we have this patchwork of state regulations. It's really in this gray zone. Safe banking has not passed. That's kind of hurt the entire field. So the U.S. can help on that front. A big part of this, I think, goes to the state regulators, though. They really need better scientific understanding and enforcement of the activities that are happening. The best way, as a scientist, the best way I would try to set it up is have a state-owned reference lab, actually set up a lab in maybe the largest state, maybe California. I think this has been tried there. But to be able to randomly field test samples from different growers and different laboratories and compare results and see, have a reference lab, always have a certified reference material if possible, and that includes a lab testing, honestly. So, and then that's one thing, and then maybe other states can borrow some of that capacity or figure it out like that, or multi-state model, but something more on the regulator end. And also there has to be enforcement of the outliers, or at least an investigation to figure out where things are, and that they really need to be serious consequences, because you are driving legitimate, scientifically based labs out of the industry with letting this THC shopping go on, right? And then I think at the lab level, you have to hire people who have the utmost integrity, a stake in a full, complete, accurate, transparent data set. The best scientists, that should be the model that takes us to the front for the whole field. So hopefully, there's change that can happen there. I also think there's a lot more that can be done on the chemistry side, the DNA diagnostic side with cannabis. And again, you have to remember all this is in its infancy because research is just now, fits and starts, starting to answer some of these questions. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I will just close and say I appreciated the chance to speak with you about this. Hopefully it was a little thought-provoking. I'm happy to discuss anything a little further, take other questions or have a discussion on this, and also available in this field to help with consultation or research efforts. And I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.